All right, it's coming to the noon hour. So if you're joining in now, welcome to our live stream from Connecticut River Conservancy. This is our final episode of the season, Climate Change Along the Connecticut River. My name is Stacy Leonard, and I'm the events coordinator here at CRC. We'll be joined shortly by three fabulous presenters who will discuss the impacts of climate change along the rivers of the Northeast and share the work they're doing to create resilient communities in the face of the climate crisis. We're so glad you could be with us today to learn about this critical topic. And we're also streaming live on Facebook, and welcome to all who are listening through that platform. I want to take a moment to share how we're running the show today. We're really excited for our first time ever to be offering live Spanish translation. As you see on the screen depicted here on the slide, if you're looking for interpretation in Spanish, there's an interpretation button at the bottom of your screen, and you can toggle it to Spanish, and you will hear from our two wonderful translators from the UMass Translation Center. We have Katie Moonen and Neff Forney. The visuals will remain accessible to all, so let me give everybody a minute to find the button and switch to Spanish if you desire. And if you have any trouble, you can go into the chat and message to me separately. I'm Stacy Leonard. If you click the to everyone and look for my name, you should be able to find me. In addition, we're recording this episode for future access, and I'll be sharing how you can get a link to the recording later. We send an email after every live stream that has a list of all the resources, all the great things, links and ideas that have come up in the presentation, and make them available for you later. And that will be shared by the end of the day today. And then the final thing I want to share is this is a chock full presentation, and we're going to use the full hour of it for listening to our presenters. So we have this, this particular live stream is in webinar mode to allow full presentation mode. And we still do invite your questions. We're not going to have the usual Q&A session at the end, but ask you to please write your questions in the Q&A box on your screen, and we will respond by email after maybe in a day or two or three so that we can get that fully translated. So I'd love to introduce today's presenters in the order in which they are set to speak. First, we'll be hearing from Sarah Thornbrugh. Sarah is the Community Engagement and Partnerships Coordinator at CRC and also serves as the staff lead for our CRC's climate program. She has a background in natural resource management and science education, and a personal passion for talking about climate change in ways that help people make their own informed decisions about how to act. After Sarah, we'll hear from Yoni Glogower, Director of Conservation and Sustainability for the City of Holyoke. Yoni administers permitting and enforcement under the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act and advances municipal objectives related to open space protection, urban forestry, green infrastructure, and clean energy transition. Yoni holds an MS in forestry from the Yale School of the Environment, is a course instructor for the Native Plant Trust Field Botany Certificate Program, and teaches introductory embroidery at the Hill Institute in Florence. That's a class I'd love to take. Our third presenter will be Alex Rodriguez. As climate advocate for Save the Sound, Alex is responsible for youth mobilization, supporting climate-related communications, coalition building, community engagement, and legislative advocacy. Prior to joining Save the Sound, Alex served as community organizer to the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters, where he planned and executed campaigns relating to climate action, voting rights, and electric school bus advancement. He has also served in roles such as chair of the Public Participation Subcommittee of the Governor's Council on Climate Change and vice chair of Hartford's Advisory Commission on the Environment. In his free time, Alex enjoys spending time with family, reading, singing, and dancing. So you can see we have an awesome group here, and I'm eager to turn the program over to Sarah. So without further ado, I will pin Sarah and see you at the end.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I work for the Connecticut River Conservancy. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today to talk together about what climate change means for the Connecticut River watershed, what's being done to address it already, and what we can do as people in this place to think about climate change as we move through our lives. So here's a map of the Connecticut River watershed. I wonder if you recognize any of these places or landmarks. There are so many people that live, work, or recreate in these 11,000 square miles of land surrounding the Connecticut River and all of its smaller tributary rivers and streams. Maybe you're one of those people like I am. If you'd like, please pop where you're joining us from into the chat if you haven't already. But I wanted to start us off together for our talk about climate change by defining some of the words that we use when we talk about it and speaking just a little bit about the science of how climate change works. So climate change is what we call something we see happening right now on this planet. Our atmosphere, the thin blanket of gases that surrounds our planet, is changing. And because of the way our atmosphere interacts with the heat generated by the sun, the result is a change in the Earth's overall climate. And we define climate as the patterns of weather and temperature that determine how all living things on Earth behave. So what's the difference between weather and climate? Well, weather refers to short-term changes that happen in the conditions of a specific place. So this can include temperature, humidity, precipitation like rain and snow, cloud cover, just to name a few. This can be thought of as kind of a day-to-day or maybe a moment-to-moment change. But climate, on the other hand, is the average of weather conditions and weather events like storms in a specific place over a long period of time. Climate's usually determined over a period of 30 or so years. And as weather changes over time begin to define new normal weather conditions that we would experience in a place, we would see a change to the climate in that place. And this is what we mean when we say the climate changes. And because the climate in a place determines how all living things behave from an ecological perspective, eating, breathing, reproducing, migrating, living, surviving, it's really important to pay attention to a changing climate. From the perspective of climate science, our climate is changing very quickly. And most of you might have heard that the biggest change is that the planet's getting warmer. And climate change is also sometimes called global warming, which is the phrase most often used to describe the pattern of increasingly warmer average global temperatures that we see happening all over the world. So what does that mean? Average global temperatures refer to surface air temperatures. And if we measure the hottest and coldest temperature of the surface air, which is what we breathe and live in every day, places all over the planet, and average them over a month, and then average those averages over a year, what we get is an average high and an average low temperature for places all over the world. And humans have been measuring surface air temperatures for hundreds of years with enough data to estimate temperatures across the entire planet since 1880. And what these measurements show is that the average surface air temperatures, both the highs and the lows, are continuing to increase everywhere. Now, this doesn't mean it doesn't get warmer or colder than that average temperature on any given day in any given place. But what it does mean is that on more days than not, the hottest and coldest a place will get in a day, over a month, over a year, is just a little bit warmer than it has been for a long time, about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer on average across the planet than what was measured about 100 years ago. And it continues to get warmer. And this may not seem like a whole lot, but a warmer average global temperature, even just 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, translates into enormous changes in two things: weather patterns and how water cycles through the environment. And these are things that we can see, and they are inextricably linked to a warming planet. So I wanted to talk very quickly about how climate change influences water and how water moves through the environment, right? Our towns, communities, and our natural spaces. Water covers about 70% of the planet, and it cycles through the environment over and over again. So the same water that rains on us, flows through our local rivers today, has been cycling through the environment for millions of years. And to understand the ways that warmer global temperatures impact water, we need to review the way that water moves through the environment, sometimes called the hydrologic cycle. So here's a picture of how water gets recycled in the environment. It falls from the sky, flows across the land into rivers and oceans, or maybe it seeps into the ground. Maybe it gets taken up by plants. Maybe it gets stored as ice in glaciers and ice caps. But eventually, all of that water, even the frozen stuff, evaporates back into the air as water vapor, rises back into the sky, collects together as clouds, and it falls from the sky to start the process over again. And when the temperature is warmer, even just slightly, this cycling process intensifies. So water moves more quickly, which means that wet places get wetter and dry places get drier. And this is something that we can see. I also wanted to quickly review what we see climate change doing to the weather patterns we're seeing all over the world, and more specifically here in the northeast part of the continent. I've called out a few of them here. If we had more time, I'd love to move through the mechanics of how each one of them relates to a warmer climate, but just to keep us moving, I'm going to touch on some basics. So what we know is that warmer surface air temperatures and warmer ocean surfaces make water evaporate more quickly, which increases the amount of water vapor in the air. This increases the amount of water we see falling in a single rain event, and this leads to more frequent flooding. In the US, we've seen the most extreme changes to precipitation, both rainfall and snowstorms here in the Northeast. And in the Connecticut River watershed, we continue to see an increase in the amount of rain falling all at once. Water in amounts that our local cities and towns and rivers and streams just aren't built to hold yet. And we expect this trend to continue. We also know that warmer, wetter air creates conditions for the formation of bigger, more destructive storms all year long, all across the planet. Hurricanes and tropical storms here in the North Atlantic Ocean are increasing both in intensity and in frequency. And this has been directly linked to increased surface temperatures in the Atlantic Ocean due to climate change. We know that in periods of low precipitation, water evaporates more quickly from a warmer ground than it would at a cooler temperature. This means that dry periods stay drier for longer, contributing to longer, more persistent droughts, which some plants and animals never recover from. Droughts like the one experienced here in the Connecticut River watershed between June and December of 2020 can have lasting impacts on the environment long after the drought is over. These conditions are also expected to continue. And finally, we know that even slightly warmer temperatures convert frozen water currently stored as glaciers and ice caps into liquid water. And this water is increasing the amount of water in oceans worldwide. Globally, the level of the seas has risen 7 to 8 inches since 1900, with 3 of those inches since 1993. And relative to the sea level in 2000, sea level is expected to rise 4 to 7 more inches by 2030, 6 to 14 more inches by 2050, and 12 to 51 more inches by 2100. This has tremendous impacts for the Connecticut River and all of the homes, businesses, trails, habitat, and facilities that are built around it. I wonder if you've seen any weather like this where you are. Feel free to share with us in the chat if so. But we know that warmer temperatures have significant impacts on weather, and that weather has significant impacts on the towns, communities, and waterways here in the Connecticut River watershed. This is really complex stuff, and there's a lot more information available. So after my talk, I'll put some links in the chat if you want to educate yourself a little bit more. But let's move on for just a quick minute and talk about why we know this is all happening. So just like fixing a car or treating an illness, to better understand what we can do, we have to first understand what's causing the problem. Climate change is being drastically accelerated by the combustion or burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are carbon-based materials that are made through the fossilization of the remains of living things that have been compressed under the ground for a really long time, like a minimum of 50 million years. Gas, oil, coal, petroleum, that stuff that most plastics are made from, these are all fossil fuels, and they have to be mined from deep in the ground to be burned. Removing and burning fossil fuels releases gases into the air that are changing the atmosphere of the planet. These gases collectively are called greenhouse gases. And they're called greenhouse gases because they accumulate in the Earth's atmosphere and change the way the heat from the sun is either retained or released from the planet. They hold heat in like a greenhouse. And there are several ways that these gases are put in and absorbed out of the atmosphere naturally. However, the large amount of greenhouse gases that we see have accumulated in the atmosphere today that natural processes can't seem to keep up with have been put there in large amounts by burning fossil fuels. And in North America, many other parts of the world, fossil fuels are mined and burned to get energy all the time. And they're in a lot more places than you might think. I mean, think about what powers your car, home, bus, plane. Think about what fuels the planes and ships that transport all the stuff we buy here from all over the world. Think about how many plastic items people might use in a week, a month, a year. All of these things add up, and they continue to release large amounts of greenhouse gases. And the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere play a huge role in global temperatures. When more greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere than our planet can remove naturally, we see an increase in the heat being retained. And this additional heat, combined with how our world has modified natural processes that absorb these gases, like when we cut down trees, is what's resulting in the rapid increase in average global temperatures that we refer to as climate change. And these greenhouse gases, they stay in the atmosphere retaining heat for a really long time, some of them for as long as 100 years after they were released. So think about what your ancestors were doing 100 years ago, or what your relatives are going to be doing 100 years from now. Continuing to burn fossil fuels continues to worsen the impacts of climate change that we're facing today and in the future as a global community. So why does it matter that the climate is changing? And why does it matter that burning fossil fuels is accelerating it? Well, as we talked about already, a changing climate means more floods, droughts, and storms for our towns, communities, and natural spaces. And these are impacts we already see doing damage, and impacts that our towns and communities aren't equipped to see without more damage. And science tells us this is going to continue as climate change continues to worsen. The money and privilege that it takes to rebuild after damage from the impacts of climate change are not available to everyone. In fact, they're not available to most. And some places, like those that the seas are literally rising to cover, are not going to be places where it's safe to live anymore. So humans and non-humans, right? Like the plants and animals that live in these places too, they need places to live and be safe. We need land to grow food on that isn't flooded or impacted by drought. So given the number of people impacted now, and those climate change is going to continue to impact over the length of time, science tells us we're going to be seeing these impacts. There's no area in the world, no person, no family, no community that isn't facing crisis because of the climate change. And in particular, low wealth communities, Black and brown communities, and developing nations with limited resources to adapt are going to continue to be hit the hardest. And that's what makes the climate crisis, what we call the result of climate change on our communities, on people, one of the biggest social and environmental justice issues of our lifetime. Understanding climate change goes way beyond just science. The impacts of climate change across the world, and even here in the Connecticut River watershed, are disproportionately imposed onto the human and non-human communities with fewer available resources to adapt and take action to protect themselves. This is why we view climate change as a global climate crisis. And we here at CRC, alongside so many of our partners and neighbors, believe that we're responsible to act to protect our most vulnerable communities. And this is where all of us comes in, right? We have to address climate change together. We have choices. We're going to talk about this more in just a minute. But right now, I want to tell you that there's a lot of work happening here in the Connecticut River watershed to strengthen our towns and communities to be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So I'm joined today by two colleagues and friends that are working to strengthen their communities in the face of climate change. I also wanted to share what CRC and some of our partner groups are doing now and thinking about for the future to make the Connecticut River watershed more resilient in the face of a changing climate. So I'm briefly going to share two things that CRC is working on that I'm really excited about. The first is tracking our carbon footprint, or the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we are responsible for by doing the work that we do. In 2020, CRC worked with the UMass Clean Energy Extension Office to develop a tool that helps us track the greenhouse gas emissions of many aspects of our operations, but not all of them. We now have 3 years of carbon footprint data to work with, and we're taking a look at how we can use that information to change how we do what we do to lessen our impact. We're also working to find out if and how we can track the emissions of some of the more complex aspects of our work, namely our volunteer programs and the annual Source to Sea cleanup. And this work will allow us to track our progress towards reducing the carbon footprint of our activities. Another thing that I'm really excited about is the work that we're doing with our CRC community to raise our collective carbon consciousness, or an awareness of how our actions impact the amount of greenhouse gases that enter the atmosphere and how this connects us to the changing climate. Almost every decision that we make has a greenhouse gas emission that's associated with it, and understanding our options to reduce our carbon footprint on a personal level can make all the difference. And we have decided to start with our annual Source to Sea cleanup. And we've introduced a new set of volunteer materials that offer tips on how to have a climate-friendly cleanup, including asking volunteers to limit their transportation to and from cleanup sites when possible. Transportation makes a big difference when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. And it's our hope that one day people are going to be able to participate in the Source to Sea cleanup from their own neighborhoods and communities. That is, until we don't need to clean up the river anymore. I also want to give a shout out to two of CRC's tributary groups, the Deerfield River Watershed Association and the Fort River Watershed Association, for the work and thinking that they're doing to address climate change. So in 2020, DRWA teamed up with CRC to work on a river restoration project located on the North River in Coleraine. The project was implemented to repair riverbank erosion that was created in 2011 during Tropical Storm Irene and increase the river's resilience in the face of increasing precipitation. And the repair efforts included armoring the river with wooden supports, replanting a forested buffer along the river, and improving fish habitat by making the river narrower and deeper and returning some woody habitat features to the water. In 2021, the Fort River Watershed Association and CRC started working with the town of Amherst to consider what it might look like to restore the old Hickory Ridge golf course property with more water in mind, and thinking about the value of restoring natural spaces for rivers to store and filter water. Most of that property is located in the Fort River floodplain, and it has over 1 mile of the Fort River running right through it. It also sees very frequent floods, and restoration work on this important stretch of the Fort River would store more floodwaters, minimize nutrients that are flowing into the river from area runoff, store carbon in the soils of the floodplain, and increase habitat for rare species in the area. So I wanted to leave us all thinking about what else we can do in our lives and our own homes, our own communities, to take action to respond to a changing climate. And a great way to take action against the climate crisis in your own life is to stay aware of what's happening and how we're connected to it. Being informed goes a long way, and it matters. So I offer the following climate-friendly actions to you to consider as we all go from here. So when you can, skip oil, gas, coal, petroleum, and petroleum-based products like plastic. Buy local food or grow your own. Walk or ride a bike or skate or wheel instead of driving a car. If you can, select an energy provider for your home that only uses renewable, non-fossil fuel energy. If you can, support businesses and organizations that are acknowledging the climate crisis and taking action to do whatever it is they do better and with less fossil fuels. And if you can, my friends, please vote. In particular, consider supporting people who are committed to making any adjustments needed to our towns, all their systems to be able to accommodate more water, higher temperatures, and more extreme weather. And also consider supporting people who are committed to making the needed changes so our towns and schools and apartments and homes don't run on fossil fuels anymore. So thank you so much for listening. I'm gonna hand things over to Yoni now to talk about what's happening in Holyoke, Massachusetts to make the community there more resilient to our changing climate.
Oh, well, thanks so much, Sarah. My name is Yoni Glogower. I'm the Director of Conservation and Sustainability for the City of Holyoke. I just want to say thanks to you, Sarah, for providing the basics on climate change impacts, just because we're in Holyoke, we're concerned about all the same things on a local level. More storms, heavy rain events, overall hotter temperatures, air quality concerns, and also how this intersects with existing inequities and has disproportionate impacts on communities that have been historically disenfranchised. So the way this looks on a municipal level is a lot of individual projects and little pieces that fit together. Since I just have 15 minutes today, I wanted to focus on 2 recent planning projects that are really looking at the big picture in Holyoke, identifying our major weaknesses and areas where we need to improve the built environment to create a more resilient landscape. So I'm going to start with this. This is a study of Holyoke's impervious surfaces that we started in 2020, 2021. This was funded by a municipal vulnerability preparedness grant from the state. And our goal was to really get good data on what all the different land cover types in Holyoke, and especially the different types of impervious surfaces that cover the landscape. This is a snapshot of downtown Holyoke, and these are all the different land cover classes that we were looking at. So not just is it paved or unpaved, but getting deeper, are they public parking lots, sidewalks, driveways? And then simultaneously, we did a grid analysis, a study of all the impacts that come from having a lot of impervious surface, areas where water can't infiltrate in the soil, so it runs overhead and has a lot of implications for life in a warming and changing climate. So this was a very detailed analysis that we hired on looking at everything to risk to water quality, the status of our sewers. Holyoke's industrial community that developed and grew rapidly in the latter half of the 19th century. Oh, you can't see my mouse because I'm not controlling this, but you can see the network of canals that was built during that time period, dug almost completely by hand, and all the paper factories and industry that still characterizes that area. So a lot of impervious surface, a lot of aging infrastructure, and overall a sewer system where stormwater and sanitary sewers combine as opposed to those going in separate areas. So that has a lot of implications for water quality in the Connecticut River, because when we have heavy storm events, there's a series of overflows that are located along the river, so that instead of all the sewage mixed with stormwater backing up into people's homes or onto the street, they actually go straight into the Connecticut River. So Holyoke and many communities that are left with this difficult situation are undergoing a costly and ongoing process to separate the sewers wherever possible, but it is expensive and takes a long time. So, and then we're looking at things also like tree canopy cover. So how much shade is there in these areas, and other metrics. And we're also worried about flooding as well, not just from the river overflowing during heavy storm events, but also localized flooding in areas where there's depressions in the impervious surface. So the goal of this study was to really get a handle on what Holyoke looks like as a whole and start to prioritize some area for some nature-based solutions and green infrastructure. And I'll show an example of that on the next slide. Oh, I guess I won't show it on the next slide. So one thing we're really concerned about in Holyoke, as are a lot of very highly densely developed communities, is something called urban heat island. This is the phenomenon whereby areas that have a lot of paved surface that are reflecting radiation from the sun, you actually have higher ambient air temperatures in the downtown areas relative to the surrounding countryside. So this is just a generalized graph showing on average, it could be anywhere from 10 to 15 degrees hotter on a hot day in downtown Holyoke, for instance, where there's a lot of paved areas, concrete and buildings, as opposed to areas that have a lot more tree canopy cover or other vegetation. So all these threats coming together, coming at us all at once. So next slide, please. So something we're trying to do more of in Holyoke, and that the study was aiming to look at more priority areas to do, is to build more green infrastructure. So instead of conveying stormwater underground, where it goes into the sanitary sewer and to the river ultimately, we can build green infrastructure facilities. Different types include rain gardens, bioswales. The idea is a vegetated these tend to be vegetated structures that absorb stormwater into the soil from impervious surfaces and allow it to infiltrate and stay in the soil instead of going directly to the sewer system. So here's an example of a rain garden that was built in 2012 when we were redoing our public library. This is kind of the lot across the street that serves the library. And I included actually the site plans for it so you can kind of see how it works. You've got kind of a depression area with native plants and soils. And the parking lot is designed so that when it rains, the water flows for the most part from the paved areas right into this structure. And if it's not too heavy of a storm, it'll just sink into the soil and stay there and water the plants that we have. But you can see a landscape drain on the left where if there's too much water and it does start to overflow, it goes to this giant underground water storage facility that's underneath it. So these are deceptively, these things look simple, it just looks like a garden, but these are actually well-designed complex systems that can help mitigate some of the harmful impacts of heavy storm events, and also reduces impervious surface and has more vegetation, thereby addressing urban heat island. Next slide. Along with our study, we got funding from the Nature Conservancy to do community outreach related to green infrastructure in Holyoke. We also want to help people understand what these structures are and why they're important. And also the challenge is ongoing maintenance and upkeep has to be weeded and kept in good shape over long periods of time. So this is that same rain garden. Just a few weeks ago, we had a community workshop explaining how it worked, and also led some activities to remove some of the trees that had come in. You don't want giant trees coming into these facilities. And also repairing the inlet where over time the water washed away the stones that kind of clean the stormwater as it comes in and slow it down. So you can see on the next slide, cool stuff we did. Yeah, look at that beautiful inlet. So that's crushed stone. And then behind that, we put in a filter strip of sod. And the goal is that the stones will kind of slow down the water as it comes in. It's not going to erode the sediments inside of the rain garden. And then also there's kind of a filter strip of sod that'll clean the water a little bit before it gets in. So we want to build more of these facilities in Holyoke. We've got some, hopefully, grants coming to design more facilities in Holyoke like this, but also trying to address the need for ongoing maintenance and community awareness. Next slide. Okay, so here's the second project I'm going to talk about that's also closely related to impervious surfaces and climate resiliency. To sort of pair with that study, the city's long identified the need to really look at its urban forestry management practices. So this is the same MVP funding source. We wanted to create an Holyoke urban forest equity plan to sort of shape our priorities and practices for the city going forward. Next slide. And we want to look at Holyoke as a whole, but we need to address the fact that some areas already have far fewer trees than others. There's higher risk areas that need more attention. So this sort of shows the target area that we were looking at for this study, focusing on the 4 lower neighborhoods in Holyoke, downtown, Churchill, the Flats, and South Holyoke, they're called. And this is because we know from previous studies and aerial imagery that this is the part of the city that it's already characterized by the highest proportion of impervious surfaces. It's at the highest risk of being next to the river from flooding, and also has the lowest tree canopy cover of any of the neighborhoods in Holyoke. And why are we calling it an equity plan? And that's because we can't pull apart the ecological disparities from the social ones. So I've circled the general target area on the left. On the right is an example of a historic red line map of Holyoke. You've probably heard about this practice starting in the 1930s. That's where the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation was assigning grades to different residential neighborhoods, advising lenders of where they should and should not invest the relative mortgage security. So these red areas you're seeing, D1 through D3, that was the lowest grade that they assigned. And they used a lot of discriminatory practices when making these designations. It's a combination of not just housing quality, but also the racial and ethnic identity of the residents. So as a result, segregation was exacerbated throughout this time period and really disincentivized investment in these neighborhoods. So there's a lot to unpack there, more than can be done in a 15-minute presentation. But we need to recognize that if we're thinking about doing improvements to the built environment, because it's no surprise that today, these are neighborhoods in Holyoke that meet the Massachusetts threshold for environmental justice communities under all 3 categories. So having a minority majority population, low household income, and English isolation. So we really wanted to build a plan that not only focused on this area, but reflected the priorities and desires of the residents and their lived experiences here. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, most of my slides are of actual data that was collected in the field and the analysis. I should say we did a series of community workshops in English and Spanish. This was height of the pandemic, so we had to do it over Zoom, which was challenging, but really tried to get a grasp of what people thought about how the city manages its urban forest canopy and what they would like to see, and whether there was interest in participating in tree planting events or maintenance. So a lot to work with there. But one thing we're also able to do with the grant funding, just to provide these workshops with baseline information, was Holyoke's first public tree inventory. And we're going to expand it later to the rest of the city. We recently got some new grant funding for that. But here's what it looks like in terms of the 4 target neighborhoods of our study. So each of these green dots is a tree in the public right-of-way in a park or on the street side that the city manages. And for each one, we know the species, we know what the health conditions are, we know how big its diameter is, so how big the tree is overall. And you can also see disparities in where we even have trees. So you see to the left side of the canals, downtown and Churchill have relatively more public trees, wider streets, bigger tree belts, more parks. But looking at the flats, relatively few, many streets with no tree covered for any shade or stormwater infiltration. Next slide, please. How much time do I have, Sarah? Or anyone? All right, I'll just go through. So here are some results and statistics based on that study. So here's a chart that shows the 4 different neighborhoods. The estimate, oh, Stacy says I'm good. That's so affirming, thank you. Percent of land covered by impervious surfaces. So pretty high proportions, anywhere from 66 to 73% of the land cover is pavement, concrete buildings, radiating heat, as opposed to the city average of 30%. And it's not surprising, conversely, percent of land covered by tree canopy is low, 10 to 16%, definitely below that 25% recommended threshold for mitigating the worst effects of climate change. Next slide. But it's not just the number of trees. We have to think about things like species diversity and the condition that the trees are in. So because we had an on-the-ground tree inventory, we were able to figure out what are the most common trees that were planted. Industry standard says you don't want any more than 10% of a given species. And that's because if invasive insect or pathogen comes through and kills all of one species, hopefully there's enough diversity in the landscape that you're not losing all your trees at once. So it's good that none of these are much above that 10% threshold, but there are effects like Norway maple, Callery pear being invasive species, and also concerns over green ash, which I'll talk about on the next slide. We also have the size distributions. Oh, sorry. Well, that's fine. I was just gonna say the chart on the right shows the darker green bars show percent of trees in Holyoke that are in different size classes. So young trees, established, maturing, and mature. That's based on the diameters of the trunk. And then on the right is the industry recommendation. You also you want not just a good diversity of tree species, but trees of different ages. You don't want a bunch of old trees that are all in decline at the same time. You want to keep a continuous, multi-aged forest canopy going. So we're not doing too bad there. You can see a lot of young trees, about 42%. And that's largely due to the presence of the DCR Greening the Gateway Cities program, which has been planting free trees for residents and in public spaces in Holyoke since 2016. But this is just showing how important that program is. Okay, 3 minutes, I can do it. All right, next slide. So here's an example of why species diversity is really important. You probably heard of the emerald ash borer found in Detroit in the early 2000s. It's an invasive beetle that can kill a mature ash tree in just a couple of years. So this is a screenshot on the left of all the green ash trees that we have in Holyoke, all those yellow dots, especially along the Main Street corridor, which is a really important public space that goes through the flats and South Holyoke. So this is a big concern of ours, because again, we're worried about losing all trees on the same size of the same species simultaneously from this insect. And thereby we have issues of urban heat island, losing all that shade at the same time in a really critical area of the city. Next slide. And then I'm not going to get too much into detail on this, but this shows metrics of the relative health of different tree species. So just because there's a tree there doesn't mean it's in good shape. We really need to develop in Holyoke a more robust and proactive tree maintenance program so that we're able to maintain and expand the health of our urban canopy instead of going into decline. Next slide. So here's a cool thing that started in 2014. This is our public municipal nursery. So DCR is able to plant within a narrow planting range in Holyoke, but we also got a grant to raise some of our own trees and start to put these out in other areas in Holyoke in 2014. And I have a slide in a few slides that shows our recent tree planting event at Kennedy Park in Holyoke. Next slide. And there's some proactive ways that the city is approaching reforesting the landscape. This is a grant that we got from the EEA 2 years ago to improve our tree pits. So the built environment was often not created to accommodate trees and other green infrastructure. This is a grant that we were able to use to create and expand existing tree pits and put in good soil and have all the right conditions for trees to thrive. So I just love the before and after of this one. On the left, what it looked like, and on the right with the newly planted trees. That will, it's a 2-for-1 effort, right? We're reducing impervious surface, stormwater infiltration, but also expanding our urban canopy in areas where it didn't exist in the past. And then I think I just have one more slide. Yeah, so again, community engagement, trying to prioritize that wherever possible. This is a community tree planting event we did at Arbor Day this past April. And it was really fun and good way to build community involvement and hopefully show that we're taking urban forestry seriously in Holyoke, though we still have a lot of ways to go. So that's it. Thanks so much.
Yoni, awesome presentation. Thank you for laying out those effective methods in green infrastructure and adaptation and resiliency, and as well as Sarah for laying out climate science and how important it is for us to engage to begin with. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Alex Rodriguez. I work with Save the Sound as a climate advocate. And Save the Sound is a regional environmental organization dedicated to leading on climate, preserving endangered lands, protecting Long Island Sound and its rivers, and restoring ecosystems. My role is to support grassroots mobilization, legislative advocacy, community organizing, and climate-related communications. I'll move on to the next slide, please. So our mission statement is we envision a Long Island Sound region where the vitality of nature will be protected for people and wildlife now and for many decades to come, a region in which citizens and people from all walks of life can unite in transforming struggling habitats, polluted rivers, endangered wildlife, and a threatened planet into resilient, healthy, vibrant, and inspiring places that sustain communities. Next slide. This is an overview of our impact map. This is where Save the Sound's work takes place throughout the region. The climate icons are highlighted in pink. These are areas that pertain to most of my department's work. And it grows as many of our projects do. And so our green infrastructure work, on the other hand, is highlighted in green. My colleagues in the ecological restoration department at Save the Sound, they have worked alongside the Connecticut River Conservancy in the past on habitat restoration and creating lasting physical change that strengthens ecosystems for the benefit of wildlife and communities. Next slide. This is an overview of how our work consists. We have pollution monitoring that is led by the Water Quality Department. We take legal action when we are given sufficient evidence that a company or municipality or state is not in compliance with certain environmental rules. There is an extensive process that we have internally to determine whether we file litigation to protect the environment. We have ecological restoration, as I mentioned earlier, and we have legislative advocacy, which is where a lot of my work in the climate department takes place. Next slide. So Sarah and Yoni have laid out the science and helpful adaptation and resilience measures to be taken in the face of climate change. And I'm here to present to you the mitigation component of all this. It is so crucial that we transform our economy into an energy efficient, renewable based economy for generations to come. We must do this as soon as possible. In celebrating the work we do regarding climate, we have an intense commitment to mitigating carbon emissions from all sectors of our society. In a later slide, I will elaborate on two key policies: our state's climate law, the Global Warming Solutions Act, and a proposal called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, also known as TCI. Next slide, please. Climate tactics that we can use to support resilient communities really tie into mitigation. As I was saying in the previous slide, it is important that we slash climate and air pollution while building a thriving renewable energy economy. It is important that we empower citizens to sue governments or whomever is at fault for an environmentally catastrophic event. It is important that we give them the tools to sue the government when they fail. And it is also important that we unite the thousands of citizens from all walks of life who believe that together we can make a Connecticut that is climate resilient. And on restoration and resilience, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how important it is to support green infrastructure projects, such as the removing of barriers, such as dams to improve the flow of water, managing stormwater through bioswales and rain gardens, and living shorelines projects, such as habitat restoration and natural buffers. But to elaborate more on particular policies that can mitigate the climate crisis, I will turn to the next slide. And so I'd like to present to you some wins and losses of this past legislative session in Connecticut. In the wins column, you'll see that Connecticut has displayed an astounding commitment through passage of legislation, which codifies Governor Lamont's Executive Order 3. Towards the beginning of his time in office, he declared an executive order calling for carbon-free electricity, calling for a 100% carbon-free electricity standard by 2040. And supporting legislation that was passed this past session also pertained to the doubling of the megawatt capacity for shared clean energy facilities and commercial solar projects. It is important that while we reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, we increase the efficiency of the energies we have and expand the renewable portfolio in coalition with those on the ground leading this work, installing these solar panels. Another big win this past session was the implementation of California's medium and heavy duty vehicle emission standards through a piece of legislation that was called SB4, an act concerning Connecticut's Clean Air Act. Another thing this bill did was allow the public, give funding for the public and private sector to increase adoption of electric vehicles and end the purchase of diesel transit buses by 2024, and set a goal for an all-electric school bus fleet by 2040. In addition, we expanded the eligibility for the Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy Program, otherwise known as CPACE, to allow the financing of EV charging infrastructure and resilience improvements on qualifying commercial real property. These particular areas, energy and electric vehicles, surround my work a lot at Save the Sound, because we are advocating for clean modes of transportation. It is important that we decarbonize the transportation sector because it is the leading source of pollution in our state. And so in addressing unfinished business, I'd like to address the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is Connecticut's climate law. There were two iterations of pertaining to this law in 2008 and 2018. 2008, a standard was set to reduce carbon emissions 80% by 2050 to really put Connecticut on a path to phasing out its reliance on carbon emitting technologies. This was followed in 2018 by a bill, I believe it was called an Act Concerning Climate Change Mitigation, that put a more faster target of 45% reduction by 2030. And this is particularly important because within this past year, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection announced we are not on target to meet the 2018 targets. We were not on target to meet the 2018 target within the Global Warming Solutions Act. Every year, the DEEP is required to take a greenhouse gas inventory report and provide that to the public. And it showed that emissions from the transportation and building sectors increased. And so my team at Save the Sound wants to equip citizens with the ability to sue the government under the Environmental Protection Act, and really making sure that we can hold the government accountable to its climate goals. But at the same time, we need to work in tandem with government and allies such as Connecticut River Conservancy to reduce carbon emissions from all sectors of society. And so the Transportation and Climate Initiative is a policy proposal that I see coming back. This was a cap and invest program proposal to slash pollution, transportation related greenhouse gas emissions, and invest in clean transportation options. It would have required polluters such as Exxon and Shell to enter an auction. And in this auction, they would have outbid each other for the price of pollution. And whomever outbidded the rest set the standard. I realize that may be a sensitive topic given the state of gas prices today, but in reality, it is really the only way to set a standard to make sure that gas prices do not increase. And while increasing the adoption of electric transit, electric school buses, the electrification of freight, more street safety planning, and electric vehicle chargers placed on streets. And the last point I'd like to address is home energy labeling. There was a home energy labeling proposal that would have required landlords to provide a home energy label when offering units for rent. Fortunately, this bill was not acted upon. It passed one chamber, but did not pass the other. And so we supported this option in particular because we believe there should be transparency to renters when they are looking for a new home. They should have energy efficient appliances within that home. And so I will turn it over to the next slide, please. Here are some next steps. I would say the prime next step is to ask to meet with your respective state legislators to discuss key mitigation legislation, such as the GWSA and TCI. I've offered a sample script here, and I will make sure to coordinate with the River Conservancy on getting this sample script out and any follow-up resources that's put forward. Next slide. And so we're hoping that you'll consider a partnership with Save the Sound in the future if you ever need any resources in communicating legislators the urgency of the climate crisis. There's many ways to make an impact for climate action and sustainability. You may sign up for our action alerts, savethesound.org. Then if you want to take this championhood for your community a step further, let's work together in declaring a climate emergency declaration in your town. I just held a webinar this past week on the topic, and I will drop my email in the chat. I'm working to build grassroots committees to fight for a safe and healthy environment. And this work continues on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alex and Yoni and Sarah, for this tremendously informative presentation. It's really strong. You've laid out some great blueprints and examples of what's happening in your communities and how people can get involved. Thank you so much for all this work. I just want to share, as we run to the last minute of our time, You see contacts on the screen here. We would like you to know that you can continue to ask questions of the presenters by email. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to share any questions that have been posted to us in the background in a follow-up email with you. So special thanks to Yoni and Alex for joining us today, and also to Kathy and Neff for doing the tremendous Spanish interpretation in our Spanish channel. This is the end of our live stream series for the season. We hope that you'll join us next year for season 4. And in the email that I send later with all the resources and things that were mentioned today, lots of links, there'll also be a feedback survey where you can give us some ideas of live stream topics you'd like to see us present. So we're hoping that the summer will bring more in-person events, and hope to see you at some of those. Stay tuned to our events calendar at ctriver.org/events. And we hope to see you out on the river. So thanks again, enjoy your day. And thank you again to all of our presenters and everyone for being here.